At the top of the building, the scientist led the way through an anteroom. Then a guard threw open the double doors into a massive ballroom, hung from floor to ceiling with jewels, crests, and artwork. At the far end, in front of a vast tapestry, was a throne. On it sat a man dressed in shades of emerald green with some sort of breather attachment on his face and a horned head. The portions of his skin that were visible appeared rutted and creased like dried hamburger left in the sun. Physically, he was revolting, but he had a presence, a strange magnetism everyone in the room could feel. He stood and stepped down gingerly, walking toward the group. Halfway there, he gestured to the scientist, who rushed over, pulling out a massive syringe and injecting its contents into the wizard's chest piece. Immediately, the wizard straightened and walked with more of a purpose. He strode across the room to stand directly in front of Dorothy. She looked at him, cringing at his physical appearance, but strangely attracted to his formidable presence. "You're from the land of Oz," he said to her in a rasping voice, ignoring the rest of her group. Without awaiting an answer, he continued, "My assistant supplies me with a special, shall we say, chemical concoction when I need it. This Oz atmosphere is hard on me." He looked Dorothy up and down, glanced vaguely at her companions and down at Toto before taking her up with his stare again. "What is you wish, my pretty?" he asked, his eyes boring into her, distorted behind the emerald green lenses of his mask. Dorothy swallowed rapidly, unsure how to react to the wizard's proximity. She worked enough saliva into her mouth to speak. "I don't know how I ended up in this land, but Toto and I came here to request your help in returning to our home in Kansas." Her speech sounded oddly formal, but it seemed right. "My friends, too, each have a specific and special request." "Forget your friends," he cut her off mid-sentence, his left hand slashing a short diagonal through the perfumed air, his right holding the peculiar walking stick he favored. "They'll get what they deserve in the end. We all do." Without seeming to move, the wizard closed the distance. As he did, the rest of the group shrank away, huddling together like they could see something Dorothy couldn't. Behind them, the great hall doors swept open and odd-looking monkeys and humanoid midgets began entering. The wizard reached out casually and touched Dorothy's midsection, causing a ripple to course through her body. She shivered uncontrollably. "I've been waiting your arrival, dear girl, awaiting you for years," he said, his voice growing more hoarse. "Years." The entire world seemed to dilate to a pinpoint for Dorothy. 18 years of her life had brought her to this time, to this place, to this man, for want of a better word. Nothing else existed in this time and place. Not the Tin Woodman, not the lion, not the Scarecrow, not even Toto, who she loved dearly, just the wizard and Dorothy, and the power that was brewing between them. The wizard leaned in, even closer. Any closer, he'd be inside her skin. "Remove your top," he said quietly. What? Dorothy stammered. "I said, remove your top," the wizard said again. "Your true power, Dorothy, lies beneath." The world around Dorothy compressed even more. Time was like a tiny air bubble in a syringe. There was pressure and heat, a crescendo, and then a wave of pure, silent bliss washed over her. She pulled her top over her head in one motion and dropped it forgotten at her feet. She bared herself proudly to the wizard, the rich leather of her corset gleaming in the low light. "Very good," the wizard said, and backed away a step. He raised his voice, no longer just addressing Dorothy, but speaking to the entire assemblage. "Today is a magical day in Emerald City, a day that will be spoken about in hushed tones until the sun no longer rises. Oz is a magical land, and that power is concentrated in me, an earth creature. Now the moment I've awaited is at hand. Earth creature has come to join me here, and I welcome her. As I said, Oz is a land of magic. It's a land of granted wishes, but, you see, the wishes granted aren't always the ones asked. The laws of Ozmic magic don't work in that fashion. You may not be granted what you wish for, but you always get what you deserve." He paused and turned his attention back to Dorothy. "The silver boots are talismans, put where only you could find them. The time is now to put them on, or not. The decision is solely yours, and there will be no going back once your decision has been made." He gave her a minute. "Dorothy, my queen, what will you do?" As is a fallacy of the human condition, the largest decisions often receive the least amount of thought. Dorothy felt the heat from her corset and stared into the wizard's bug-like green eyes, feeling his power, his dominion. She never hesitated. Dorothy bent down and removed her sensible walking shoes. A hush, thick and expectantly tangible, fell over the assembled freaks. Toto moved toward her, whining quietly in the back of his throat. He put his paw on her arm, perhaps to stop her, but Dorothy shrugged him off. She grabbed the thick-soled silver boots, looked up at the wizard again, then began putting them on. And then all hell broke loose. You see, it was the boots, in combination with the corset, that brought forth the power. Dorothy and her inner unspoken needs was the source of the power. The boots and the corset were the conduit, the wizard was the director. Remember, the magical power of Oz is discretionary. It can be harnessed, as the wizard did, but its fundamental nature cannot be changed. And that nature can be cruel to those born into cruelness and debauchery. Remember the caveat. In Oz, you may not be granted what you wish for, but you always get what you deserve. Such was the case as the Ozmic power coursed through Dorothy, channeled by the talented hands of the wizard. The ugly core of all those in the great ballroom was brought kicking and screaming into the surface. The wizard and the scientist remained unchanged and watched silently, and frankly stunned, at the power that poured from Dorothy, the apocalyptic vision unfolding before them. The odd-looking monkeys and humanoid midgets transformed into their true selves. The monkeys, failed biomechanical experiments, sprouted their bat wings and quasi-mechanical appendages. The midgets turned into munchkins, viciously deformed little trolls, all suffering from a severe case of Napoleon syndrome. The lion, a meek creature coming to the Emerald City in search of courage, became what he had been in a previous existence outside of Oz. A mercenary crusader who abandoned his brothers in the heat of battle. Fierce though he may look, the lion now is forced to wear a permanent mark of shame. The enemy's weapons that pierced his entrails in his hand. The lion will exist in excruciating pain for the remainder of his mortal life. The Scarecrow, the gentleman coming to the Emerald City in search of a brain, became what he had been in a previous existence outside of Oz. An inquisitor who visited torture upon hapless victims for his government. The Scarecrow's speciality was a barbaric form of craniectomy, while the patient was still conscious, before finishing them with his rusty scythe. But it's useless now. His rotting body, held together with twine, sticks, straws, and prayers, doesn't have the strength to wield it. In suitably grim irony, the contents of his skull are being liquefied by an ancient lobotomy contraption, while a pair of undead crows picks at his remaining flesh. The Tin Woodman, the kindly if rusty hunk of metal coming to Emerald City in search of a heart, became what he had been in a previous existence outside of Oz. A sickly doctor who removed the limbs of healthy patients with an axe in a desperate attempt to rebuild his own failing body. Something of a Dr. Frankenstein crossed with an old-world cyborg, the Tin Woodman will be forced to spend eternity moving limbs made of junk parts and scrap metal. He still has his trusted axe, though his limbs are too stiff and rusty to properly utilize it. Toto was a sad tale. A loving pet dog on Earth. He had no real sin to bring to the forefront. Still, the magic of Oz works in strange ways, often dark and never pleasant. Through no fault of his own, Toto had been corrupted by the very air in the land of Oz, and was transformed into a great slug of a beast. Something of a mammalian toad that the Munchkins used for transportation. Dorothy awoke from the transformation, blinded by the leather hood wrapped around her head. She was aware of a constriction around her midsection. The corset had been cinched so tight she could barely breathe. A thin leather strap snaked over her breasts and bound her arms so tightly behind her back that she could no longer feel her fingers. The emerald key dangled around her neck. She felt his presence as he drew near. The wizard. She could feel his hot, shaky breath on her neck. She felt his fear and trepidation being so close to her power. She could hear the sounds of Armageddon all around her, squeals of pain, roars of agony, the tortured cacophony of the winged monkeys, and the raspy chirps of the Munchkins. But it was all so far away as she felt the wizard, her power channeling through him as she stood bound and sightless. "Mark her," she heard him say, his deep, raspy voice nearly breathless. She felt a prickly rope tighten around her arm, and then, though she couldn't see them, a pair of chattering munchkins branded her hip, marking her permanently with the sigil of Oz. Dorothy had never felt a pain so intense, so liberating, so sensual. It was deep and coarse and ground through her veins, carrying with it a dose of adrenaline that made her gasp and her knees buckle. The pain was so monstrous and alive. She screamed while a smile of pure bliss lit her lips. Gone was Kansas. Gone was Toto. Gone were her auntie and uncle, and her room, and her friends, and all the boys who didn't understand her. Her secret was out. The bondage freed her in ways she simply hadn't imagined. As her hood was lifted away, she stared into the green eyes of her first and final lover, her body still shaking in recovery, her diaphragm struggling with the pressure around her torso. "Welcome home, my pretty," the wizard said, stroking her burned flesh. A man turned boy in the face of Dorothy's unusual powers. She smiled again. If this was hell, Dorothy would be its queen, and she would rule the kingdom. If you're resigned to your fate, time to subscribe to your fears.
Come play with us forever.